Welcome to my third installment in my Foundational Living series, Philosophical Ideas for a Better Life. In this video, be a rebel, not a revolutionary, as a path to reform. Now, this concept comes from Albert Camus, a French-Algerian philosopher who lived during World War II in German-occupied, Nazi-occupied Paris. What Camus is usually famous for is the philosophy of absurdism, but that's not what I want to talk about today. Today I want to talk about something that peers and history has remembered him by as a rebel, not a revolutionary. He was the third generation of French colonists in Algeria, and he was born to a very poor family. Jean-Paul de Sartre was one of his contemporaries, and had a public feud between the two of them. And Jean-Paul de Sartre and Albert Camus sort of embodied the two different contrasting principles that I'm going to talk about in this video, the rebel and the revolutionary. Albert Camus has been coined the rebel, and this is for a number of reasons. Albert Camus, being called the rebel, believed that revolutionarily minded movements to overcorrect an authoritarian state or a system that isn't working always leads to more problems instead of a better solution. He believed that the authoritarian gulags or the torturing and executions of the Great Leap Forward were a core element of the authoritarianism of extremist movements and are not a sad byproduct that is something that can be avoided, but are indeed a core element of that revolutionarily minded attempt to make a change or to make reform. The problem, as he saw it, came when you accepted the new ideal and all of its concepts wholesale. When you reject the first institution or structure or thing that you are having a revolution or rebelling against wholesale, and you then replace it with another accepted set of wholesale ideas, instead of with nuance and detail pinpointing the problems and eliminating those problems, or integrating new good systems and good points into a pre-existing one to try to create something better. Instead, Camus believed that the violence done by large revolutionary movements was unjustified and only led to more cycles of violence and philosophical evil in the world. It either created or continued the cycle of returning extremism. He didn't believe that the wholesale or violent ideology could replace an existing violent or wholesale ideology and make a better world. He believed that you had to take a more integrated and rebellious approach, not a revolutionarily minded approach. He wasn't a pacifist, and he didn't believe in non-violence. He knew that violence, of course, was an integral part of any sort of rebellion or revolution. It wasn't that he thought there should be absolutely no violence, but not the revolutionary kind of senseless violence that only perpetuated the cycle of extremism further and further and for longer and longer. Camus believed that rebellion is a spontaneous event. It is a response to injustice and not a wholesale concept that one accepts without question. It is a targeted and nuanced evaluation and dismantling and recreation process. He did not believe in an ends justify the means approach, and he did not believe in cause over humanity. He thought that violent revolutionarily minded actions and movements would only fall short again and again and lead to more violent revolutionarily minded movements after a long period of human suffering and degradation. He saw that revolutionarily minded thought always portrays things in a black or white mindset. It is that contrast that he found to be so undeniably wrong, and Camus could not see the world and events with this imbalance. His belief was shaped by his experience during the Algerian Independence War. Again, Camus was the third generation of French colonists, but he supported the Algerian independence movement completely. He was even on the front lines. He was a combat medic, and he had the reputation of never lifting and using his gun and never firing a gun. One event in particular really shaped how he felt, and this was the Meloussa Massacre. In the Meloussa Massacre, there was a small town in Algeria, and there were two different liberation groups fighting for Algerian liberation. One of them was more violent and militant, and more revolutionarily minded, an ends justify the means approach to independence, and the other did not want to seek violence as the first step of action, and they wanted to seek any other path they could first. These two groups were sort of like adversaries. The revolutionarily minded, more violent, more militant, more extreme group viewed the peaceful group that was also trying to fight for peace as their enemy. And they staged an event where they murdered 374 innocent people in this town of Malusa to try to blame it on the French army to try to get the support of the Algerian people. And they killed members of the other independence party. So they were slaughtering their own brothers and sisters, their own Algerian compatriots, who were also fighting for independence because they believed the ends justify the means. And if they need to slaughter their own brethren who are also fighting for peace and spread propaganda to try to convince the public that the French army came in and slaughtered them, then that was the best course of action. That's what they believed. And after this massacre, many Algerians responded by slaughtering innocent French farmers and civilians in small villages that also had no power in the French government or French military or institutions, who had no ability to create any change. And they were also just victims and powerless in this struggle, in this war. Camus had gone to Algeria to try to bring the leadership of the two parties together to broker peace and come to an agreement. And again, he was for Algerian independence all the way. But because he was born from French colonists, many of the Algerians and the locals insulted him. And there's a French term for it, for that Algerian-born French colonist. And he was ostracized by the own group that he was trying to support. Some of his peers, notably Jean-Paul de Sartre, who remained in Paris, never seeing combat, never setting foot in Algeria, and wrote letters saying any sort of violent, extreme revolutionary action is necessary and justifiable and moral because they have to do anything it takes. And that's where Camus differentiated. He thought that humanity and philosophy and the value of life needed to rest above the cause, and that doing something like murdering 374 of your own brethren just to try to spread propaganda and frame the French army for the massacre was immoral and wrong and would only lead to more slaughter and more extreme violence. This concept is something that really stuck with me, and I think that it's important to understand this in a lot of our modern context, but also to minimize this foundational concept down to smaller issues as well. To remember to be a rebel and not a revolutionarily minded person for any given cause. Because what happens is, if you are too adamant and too ferocious and too all absorbed by a concept that can cause more problems than intended, and cause any sort of disparity or suffering or disagreement between parties to go on longer and longer, and sometimes to only get more and more extreme. When the French overthrew the monarchy and the church, and they ushered in modernism as their standard of living, as their zeitgeist, as their worldview and their value system, they wanted to establish a new set of rules, and they believed that they could on the earnest character and reasoning and judgment of good men. But because of the revolutionarily minded way that they replaced the monarchy and the church with modernism, what they did is they removed all of these systems and concepts that were there because they were there on the grounds that God or the king dictated it to the people. And they believed that they can reason their way into existence well enough on their own. They don't need God or the church or the king to tell them how things should be. And one thing that comes up in a lot of philosophical debate and conversations about French philosophers is an event during this moment where a bunch of French philosophers were trying to get petitions signed to remove the age of consent laws. Because those age of consent laws were created and dictated by the king or the church. They felt that they can determine an age of consent on their own, that any reasonable man of good character can judge the age of consent, and they can come to the ideal setting on their own through this enlightenment process. But because of their revolutionarily minded replacement, they just wanted to throw out age of consent laws. But they didn't need to, because that part was something that was fine. What they could have done is been more rebellious and pick and choose which elements were problematic to replace those ones, instead of wanting to gut everything out completely, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Then later, as modernism shifted to postmodernism, we've seen another shift where so many of the values of modernism, things that are coming back to bite us, were slashed and thrown away as deconstruction and postmodernism became the modes of thinking. And deconstructionism and postmodernism are wonderful tools, and they are necessary for the healthy transition of a population, of a worldview, of a value system. But what happens to a lot of people is they forget that there are some values in ideals. There are some values in some of these structures that we can create through reason and judgment. Now, modernism had a ton of flaws because there were a lot of points of view, there were a lot of personal experiences, there were a lot of marginalized groups, there were a lot of different sort of values and views that were not accounted for in these modernist ideals that men thought that they could reasonably arrive at. And so deconstruction was absolutely necessary. But in the US and other places, we sort of have a crisis of meaning. And people are doing things like going out and jumping and smashing cars and doing like the prank streaming and YouTube pranking and just doing general assholery in public, and they're not worried about any consequences and they don't care about anything because they have succumbed to this sort of nihilistic, cynical worldview. Because deconstruction and postmodernism, instead of applying the benefits and the necessary elements of that and extracting the necessary elements of modernism, they just slash modernism, replaced it with postmodernism, and now we're realizing that postmodernism also is not sustainable on its own and has a lot of holes and has a lot of flaws and has a lot of pitfalls that people will fall into if they rely revolutionarily minded on this new ideology, on this postmodernist ideology. Anatomy and physiology and psychology have had similar treks through the histories. In anatomy and physiology, there used to be these sort of isolated groups of people that thought everything was based on the humors or the liquids in the body. Everything was based on the minerals and the salts of the body. Everything was based on the thyroid gland and the hormones and these things in the body. And everybody sort of had this antagonistic view and approach to the other modalities, and they were all sort of fighting amongst each other and trying to each say that their view was right and explained nearly everything about anatomy and physiology, because each group was revolutionarily minded and said, let's explain everything with my way. Let's throw at everything else. Let's deny everything else. But we understand now that there is some value to each of those different modalities, and there was a lot of BS as well, and it's particularly in anatomy and physiology, from a long time ago. But we integrate these things together to try to move forward to the next step. In psychology, you also have the similar thing happening with behaviorists, with Freudians, with all sorts of different modalities and sort of sects of psychology, each sort of arguing with each other. And in the beginning, these different modalities, they were all trying to cut each other down. And now we sort of know that that's not the truth. And while, of course, you have specializations, they sort of recognize that there's value to each of them. It is a more integrated approach with an emphasis or a specialization in a certain kind of psychology. But you don't say that that kind of psychology is a way to explain all of the human experience and the human psyche and the id and the ego and the unconscious and all of that. You use an integrated approach. So modernism and postmodernism also need an integrated approach to move forward, so that we are not stuck in modernism, having a lot of people misrepresented and not part of those ideal systems that we created very flawed. And we are also not just remaining at deconstruction and staying flat at the bottom without any value created, without any meaning or organization. And it's just this pitfall that makes people sink into that cynicism and nihilism and pessimism. You can also see this principle in political struggles around the world in our modern day. You can see different groups vying and fighting for control and just sort of re-engaging the cycles of violence. India and Pakistan have just launched missiles at each other. Palestine and Israel are fighting each other. And in the Middle East in general, there's been religious and territory and resource war for 1,500 years or so. And these sort of extremist, revolutionarily minded movements just cause nothing more than a return of that cyclical violence right back at them when that person that they just deposed of power regains a bit of power. And you don't see a solution moving forward. While Camus originated this idea out of political struggle and wartime strife, and he looked back at different revolutions around him in his history, and he saw more violence begetting violence, and entire systems with flaws being replaced by a new system with new flaws, a new authoritarian destruction of humanity. These principles can also apply to other fields in our life, such as culture, or our personal interactions, or different movements that we get swept up in. Something that I've spoken about before is the intensifying culture war going on between different groups in the public discourse in mainly the US, but some other Western countries as well. The sort of feminism and anti-feminism, the alt-right versus reality, and the demonizing of one group of people because of the perceived slight or insult to another group of people, because people are very ready and primed for conflict because of their revolutionarily minded entry point into these culture war issues. People do not ever resolve this cycle of disagreement, of conflict, of butting heads. And sometimes it only escalates it to extreme levels. And some very structural and real consequences have occurred because of this in our politics and in our culture. And they are reflected in our laws and things that are being passed. And there are pitfalls to approaching our cultural issues with this revolutionary mindset. And those pitfalls, when you're coming from a progressive point of view, can be self-righteousness or leaping before you look, trying to jump too far ahead without finding out if you're on stable ground or if you have enough people to move the concept forward. And for conservatives, usually that pitfall is thinking any change is a revolutionary change, and turning a personal grief or loss into that downward spiral that alienates everything around you and sort of targets and villainizes different groups around you that are always going to be whatever sort of talking head you're listening to and telling you is the enemy and the cause of all of your problems. The last component that I want to mention and dive into a little deeper detail about that is core to these sort of revolutionarily minded ways of viewing the world and conflicts and disagreements and issues is the ends justify the means concept. Believing that whatever you do is justified as long as you get the outcome that you want. And I want to disprove that. For 3 reasons, the ends justify the means is never going to get you the solution that you want and is never going to be the best way and the best method to achieve it. The first way is if you have a goal in mind, and so you're willing to do anything to get there, but you never actually get there. So maybe you did horrible things, like murder 374 other people also fighting for Algerian peace, but if you never achieved Algerian peace, and you never actually got there, then the ends that you were seeking never came about. And therefore, all of your actions along the way could never have been justified and were just horrible, inhumane things that you did. The second way that the ends justify the means is not acceptable is if you do achieve the revolutionarily minded end, but it is the opposite side of the coin. And what I mean by this is that whenever you are taking these sort of revolutionarily minded approaches to solving an issue, it is always one way or the other, like a coin. like a Batman and Joker. Batman and Joker has been used as a metaphor for nihilism and how the two are nihilistic characters, one being active nihilism and the other one being passive nihilism. Some people think of it as positive nihilism and negative nihilism. Batman's positive or active nihilism is only able to achieve what it does because the power base supports him more than it does Joker. He is a vigilante and he is outside of the main system, but he has Gordon and he has other people that are supporting him. And in general, the public opinion and the moral opinion of the time agree with him to some degree. And so he is able to pursue his active or positive nihilism and act it out and have it be successful. The Joker is viewed as the passive or negative nihilist because it goes against the grain of the majority ethic, the majority morality, and the majority power structure. But these two points of view are the same coin. It is the same outcome. It only matters who is in power. So, in this way, and if society flops, then the Joker, the white mask shooter, now becomes the positive or active nihilist. They are now the Batman role, carrying out what at least the majority of people believe is ethical and moral, and what the power structure supports to a degree. It is the same revolutionarily minded point of view, but like a coin, it has two outcomes, because the revolutionarily minded approach always takes a not this, but a this view. Never a let's put them together and make the best we can, or let's try something else entirely. It is always just not this, this. And so you have two sides fighting that can never be the same side. The coin can never land on both. So the second way that an ends justify the means outcome is that you actually get the coin to land, but it is the wrong side. You wanted tails and it came up heads. And you lose everything, but it is the same revolutionarily minded approach. It is the same methodology, but you just lost in the end. All that you did cannot justify the ends because you got the opposite outcome. Not even didn't get the outcome, but you got the very opposite outcome of that same coin. The third reason how the ends justify the means cannot be the best method for reform or change is if you do achieve the outcome and it's the right side of the coin, it's the way you wanted it, it came up, you got it, but you cannot deny asking yourself, could we have gotten this with less human suffering? Yes. The answer is always yes. Could we have gotten here quicker? The answer is going to be yes. Could we have gotten here a better way, with less destruction, less human suffering, less cycles of violence? Yes. Could we have gotten here with a more stable foundation that will not invite another cyclical revolutionary event 15 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road when the other person takes power and flips that coin and tries to win? Whether they win or not, more cycles of violence, more philosophical evil, human suffering, torture, and devastation will happen because you kept flipping that revolutionarily minded coin. So all three ways, like the coin doesn't land on the table, you get no outcome at all. The coin lands on the table, but it's the wrong outcome. Or the coin lands on the table, it's the right side of the coin is up, but could you have done it better? Yes. The answer is always yes. There must have been a way to get there with less human suffering. So this ends justify the means revolutionarily minded approach to something is never going to be acceptable for actually creating a better future. It is not conducive to creating a better future. It is the rebellious way, the pinpointing and targeting of the problem while removing those and not perpetuating the cycle that is going to be the best method. It is the integration of all those anatomy and physiology modalities, all those psychology modalities, all the philosophy modalities together into the next best thing with bits and pieces of the old that are the things that work, that are those gems that have value, and then something new and something creative. And it will not be the next perfect creation, but it will be an actual step forward instead of just the same repeated cycles of revolutionarily minded extremism. And that's what Albert Camus saw, and that's what he fought for. And these things apply to these political or wartime events, and that's how he framed them in his life during his time. But I believe they also can apply to our cultural movements and our value systems and just the way we perceive the world, how much we're willing to buy into a new idea, how much we're willing to buy into a new relationship or buy into a trend or a fad, or how combative and ferocious we're going to be on a culture war issue, and how much we might actually push that person away from ever understanding us and coming to terms with us and being able to draw them closer. And it's only going to make that space grow, or it's going to keep that pendulum swinging violently from one side to the other without ever reaching that balance point in the middle. And there's the least turbulence and trepidation in people's lives. So that's why being a rebel and not a revolutionary is the best path towards reform and change. Pinpointing, using nuance, and targeting what needs to be changed, not throwing out an entire establishment and trying to supplant it with a new one, because that will always come with revolutionary violence, authoritarianism, and so many flaws that will prime the next revolutionary movement to begin.